Well, hello there, and welcome to this here daily podcast. I'm your pal Pete Dominic, coming at you from the solar-powered shed just north of New York City, and very happy that you have chosen to press play on today's program because I have an excellent, super smart guest who I have just the utmost respect for. He's been on the show a couple times before, but I've had the great honor throughout my career of meeting some pretty smart, pretty wise folks, and there's just very few people whose scholarship and wisdom have impacted me as much as today's guest, David Orr. Really excited to share my conversation with him about his compendium of essays, a new book, Democracy in a Hotter Time, Climate Change and Democratic Transformation. David Orr is here today. He's as great as always, and that conversation begins at about 16 minutes in today, if you want to skip ahead. But for those of you that love the news recap, here is what I've got for you today. We'll get to the horrific violence in Israel and Gaza, but first, the big story here at home was that chief coup plotter and the primary accomplice of the twice impeached, 4 times indicted, disgraced former president, Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, who allegedly looked the other way on sexual assault when he was a wrestling coach at Ohio State, the right-wing hardliner whom House Republicans nominated last week for the chamber's leadership role, lost his bid to be elected Speaker this afternoon by like 20 votes. 20 Republicans voted for candidates other than Jim Jordan, leaving him 17 votes short of the majority he needed to prevail. Jordan, for his part, spent the rest of the day trying to convince the 20 holdouts to vote for him, but he failed. And now there's another scheduled vote for today, Wednesday at 11 East. So it's either Jim Jordan or another candidate who's going to be able to secure the support of nearly every Republican. The House appears to be set to continue its prolonged stretch of leaderless paralysis, touched off by the ouster of former Speaker Kevin McCarthy 2 weeks ago, says the New York Times and pretty much every other media outlet covering Congress out there. I think this is some really good reporting from NBC News. Ali Vitale, congressional reporter, explains it with more detail and a couple of her own scoops, I think, here.
Of course, he's spending these important hours in this overnight period trying to talk to members who say that they're against him. There are some who are just dug in. But I think what's important to point out in your really great introduction here is how many different pieces this touches. When reporters on Capitol Hill talk about the fact that January 6th looms large over everything, the reason that there's such a partisan divide within this building, the reason that lawmakers have such a lack and dearth of trust between the parties, specifically Democrats towards Republicans, it's because of January 6th, and it's because of the ways that this House Republican majority has moved more into the mold of those 147 people who voted to decertify the election results and go against the will of the American people. That's a feature, not a bug, of this House Republican majority. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind, that keeping those election lies alive is a really critical part of Jordan keeping parts of this conference on board. Even today, one of the people who voted against him, Congressman Ken Buck, said that all he wanted to hear from Jordan, or one of the things he wanted, was to hear that Jordan knew that Biden actually won the election, that it wasn't stolen. And it seemed as if this morning, the last time that I spoke to Jim Jordan, he couldn't tell Ken Buck that. And he certainly wouldn't tell us reporters that as we were asking about it. So I think that's an important piece of this that we really need to keep track of, in addition to the fact that Jordan has other votes that he's trying to whip that maybe he just can't get to. The other thing that strikes me, Chris, in your introduction is the idea that moderates within this conference can say that they have problems with Jordan. And certainly it's a tough political vote to have to go back to my hometown in New York, for example, where Lawler is the representative now. It's a tough area for them to defend it. But they folded. Any 8 of them could have stuck together the way that we've seen hardliners do it, and they haven't.
They certainly did. Nelly Vitale on MSNBC with Chris Hayes last night. Let's head over to CNN. Here is 2 minutes just after Jordan lost yesterday around lunchtime. You'll hear from first Adam Kinzinger, the former Republican congressman, then Dana Bash and Jake Tapper. I thought this was a good 2 minutes of analysis to share, starting with former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger.
This is embarrassing for Jim Jordan. And I think this is going to be hard for him to fix. I mean, the only thing I can imagine is if he starts cutting deals, and those deals include things that he's never supported in the past. For instance, if he says, I'm committed to bringing Ukraine funding on the floor, he may be able to peel off 1 or 2 of those. if he says I'm committed to whatever it is, I don't know, maybe he can get to his number. But I think this is hard. I think the free vote here, I mean, the easiest thing to do if you're a Republican is to vote for Jim Jordan the first time and then go away the second time. So I think you could see even more peel away on the second round, or he consolidates. Who really knows? But I think it's going to be very hard for him to become speaker now. But that doesn't mean they're not going to use blistering pressure on Fox News, Newsmax, all those OAN to activate the base to scare the crap out of these people. But there are a lot of brave people in those 20 that I'm very proud of today.
20 no votes against Jim Jordan, at least in this first ballot, Dana Bash. I guess the question is, where do we go from here?
The question is, where do we go from here, Jake? Because this is, despite the understanding that he was going to lose a fair amount in the first ballot, I just got a message from a Jordan ally saying, quote, "This is much worse than we expected." So despite the bravado, despite what Jim Jordan himself said to Manu umpteen times in the hallways over the past 24, 48 hours about the fact that he can get there, he not only didn't get there in the first round, but they expected to do better than losing 20 fellow Republicans, as they have done.
Yeah, no, indeed. This is a lot worse than I expected he would do. We knew going into the vote that he had 6 no votes. We did not know there were 20, and he certainly lost people that weren't even on our list of people to watch.
And more evidence that being an election denier is actually an asset. It's a positive rather than a liability. You just heard from Adam Kinzinger, a very conservative Republican, a pretty conservative Republican for sure. Well, he got voted out. He got kicked out. I think actually he quit. He couldn't deal with the insurrectionists. He, of course, was on the January 6th committee. But then you also have Dick Cheney's daughter, Liz Cheney, who was forced out as well. And she was extremely conservative, voted with Trump over 90% of the time. Here's what she had to say about Jim Jordan, which I think is a blistering excoriation of Jordan, who actually wants to and thinks he might still be Speaker of the House.
Jim Jordan knew more about what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th than any other member of the House of Representatives. Jim Jordan was part of the conspiracy in which Donald Trump was engaged as he attempted to overturn the election. And if the Republicans decide that Jim Jordan should be the Speaker of the House, there will, and by the way, I don't think that's going to happen. I think he'll lose. But if they were to decide that, there would no longer be any possible way to argue that a group of elected Republicans could be counted on to defend the Constitution.
Liz Cheney letting Jim Jordan have it. Well, I guess we'll know more. There's vote scheduled for today, Wednesday, October 18th, if you're listening to this program. Then I do drop it daily with the idea that folks will at least listen to the news segment on the day, but many of these interviews I do are, of course, evergreen. One thing that is fluid is the violence in Israel and Gaza. Of course, last night there was a horrific explosion at a hospital in Gaza. And Gazan health authorities said the blast had been caused by an Israeli airstrike. The number of deaths was anywhere from 200 to 500 that I saw. The Israeli Defense Forces, said the explosion was caused by a failed rocket launch by a Palestinian armed group known as Islamic Jihad. President Biden outraged over the Gaza blast as he is expected to make a wartime visit. He's on his way there, but the trip has now changed, at least who he was going to meet, because the Arab states, Jordan in particular, has pulled out of that meeting as a result of the explosion there. And as I've looked at the evidence for who was responsible for it, it looks like we really just don't know. It doesn't really make a lot of sense that Israel would bomb a hospital where they knew there were hundreds of children and other patients. They know exactly where that hospital was. It doesn't, I don't even think, make sense for Hamas or the militant group to do it on purpose, thinking that Israel would get the blame. I think both of those seem like bad ideas. And the most likely scenario is that it was a rocket that went astray and it was an accident. But as Tim Wise writes on Twitter, serious question for people who are convinced they know for sure who bombed the hospital and that it's the evil side they oppose. If absolute proof came out that it was a side that you support, would you apologize for being wrong? No, right? That's cult shit either way. It could definitely have been Israel and it could have been Hamas. Whoever did it is guilty yet of more war crimes. And Israel is guilty of horrific genocidal collective punishment and state terrorism. Hamas is guilty of vile anti-Jewish bigotry and terrorism too. But the fact that people reflexively posted with certitude that they knew they thought what happened well in advance of the evidence proves that we're not dealing with facts here. We're dealing with people's priors. Side X or Y is evil, and thus they will view all stories through that lens. This is seriously defective thinking, broken brain shit, broken by the myths we were fed as Jews or Muslims in many cases, broken by trauma experienced by Jews and Palestinians, and broken by a lack of humility that allows us to realize that no one has the truth here. No one commenting on this stuff has perfect vision or a lens that isn't distorted, but lots of folks are sure as shit confident that they know all they need to know, even though they've mostly imbibed one or the other narrative of reality to the exclusion of the other. This is poison to the potentiality of human liberation and justice. So you can keep screaming about the decolonization on one hand and Israel's right to defend itself by any means necessary on the other, and meanwhile, other people will just keep dying, I guess. What a rant on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise, and I'll be reaching out to him and talking to him later this week or next week for sure. I thought that was just a really good, balanced, and accurate way of saying it, not only about this bombing or about a lot of other things. We just don't always know exactly what happened. And as Tom Nichols tweeted, it's okay to wait to find out more before commenting on something, especially on a site like this one, Twitter, that has been re-engineered by its owner to provide unreliable information. All right, well, that's all I've got for you on the war in Israel right now. I'll be talking to David Rothkopf tomorrow, also Eric Siegel, and who else before the week is over. We will see. I hope to see you at our Thursday night hangout, where I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we did together as a group on Monday night with over 40 listeners and subscribers. A couple of other news stories I just want to mention before we get to my guest. I thought this was pretty interesting. Former Republican candidate for Michigan for governor was sentenced yesterday to 60 days in prison for committing a federal crime during the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. His name is Ryan Kelly. I'm sure Michiganders know him. He was arrested during the Michigan gubernatorial primary in 2022. He pled guilty this July to misdemeanor count of entering and remaining on restricted grounds, admitted he rushed past U.S. Capitol police officers and used his hands to support another rider who was pulling a metal bike rack onto the scaffolding. Prosecutors also said he ripped a tarp on the inauguration stage, and now he is going to prison. And in a related story, another January 6th defendant who smashed a Capitol window with an ice axe and a giant cardboard tube before using a bullhorn to instruct riders on how to, quote, take the building, also recently received a personalized hat from former President Donald Trump. Well, he was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison on Tuesday. I said he, I meant she. Her name is Rachel Powell, known as the Bullhorn Lady. Pennsylvania woman in her early 40s, mother of 8, grandmother of 6, convicted on 9 federal counts in July after a bench trial. Why on earth was she there that day? Didn't she have responsibility to her kids and grandkids? Emotional comments at her sentencing. She said she didn't want there to be any doubt about what she thought of what she did. I'm deeply ashamed of my comment. I regret it, and it will never happen again. Okie dokie, Bullhorn Lady. Enjoy prison and your signed Trump hat. I'm sure it was all worth it. What else do I have for you? The Supreme Court reiterated on Monday that what it said 2 months ago holds, that the Biden administration they are allowed to continue to regulate ghost guns. Those are those kits that can be bought online and assembled into untraceable homemade firearms. So the Biden administration is still able to regulate them while appeals move forward. I thought that was, I guess, encouraging news, although I'll ask Siegel about it tomorrow. Also, encouraging data on crime rates. The number of murders in the United States dropped over 6% in 2022 compared to 2021, according to the FBI. Experts say preliminary data for 2023 indicates that the decline has accelerated this year, but I'm sure Republican candidates will still campaign on skyrocketing crime. In India, the country's Supreme Court rejected a plea to legalize same-sex marriage. Justice Amy Coney Barrett on the record said that she favors an ethics code for the Supreme Court. A severe drought is pushing the Amazon rainforest to the edge. Really interesting story in the New York Times about that. And apparently Britney Spears has a much-awaited memoir out. I don't pay any attention to news around her, but I think some people that listen on the show actually do. So there you go. You're welcome. I'm sure you heard about that already. Okay, well, let me get to my guest, shall we? I'm very excited to have David Orr back on the program. He is an academic, a scholar, an author, and one of the wisest people I've ever met. He's the author of 8 books about education, climate, ecological design. He's been awarded 9 honorary degrees, lots of other awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the U.S. Green Building Council and a North American Association for Environmental Education. He's a professor of practice at Arizona State University and a distinguished professor of environmental studies and politics emeritus at Oberlin College. He actually worked with the Carter administration transition team, and he has seen a lot in life, and I am so excited to get him back on the program. His new book is Democracy in a Hotter Time, Climate Change and Democratic Transformation. The foreword is by Bill McKibben, and it's got essays by so many really smart, important folks that I think you would love to read the way I have. So let's do it right now. David is not on social media. Hell, he doesn't even have an iPhone, and that's just another reason why I love this very smart man. Let's do it right now with my old friend, David Orr.
Oh, man, there he is, and here's the book. David Orr, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this. So great to see you, my friend. Been way too long.
Pete, great to see you, too.
How have you been? How are you dealing in this new world that we're in? Did you ever think we would go through a pandemic the way we did and the upheaval with democracy, which, of course, we've talked about before?
No, not at all. This has been a really weird time in American history. And it's a time of a lot of opportunity and also a lot of peril and threat. I never thought we'd go through a political revolution like we've been through with Donald Trump and so forth. So, yeah, it's a strange time.
I mean, seeing everything that you've seen and experienced, studied and written about, it just your perspective on that, on these times is always most valuable. In your new book, though, you've created, what are these called? These books which have a whole bunch of essays. I'm not smart enough for the words.
It's just a whole bunch of essays, a collection of work. So,
Democracy in a Hotter Time, Climate Change and Democratic Transformation. It is so good and so important. So many smart folks in this and a continuation of your work. Why this? Why now?
Well, PT, our attention right now is on the immediate things. Like we're looking down at our feet in the mud. And as difficult it is, the House of Representatives in transition to whatever, total chaos, Hamas and Israel at each other's throats. And those are going to appear, I think, someday as seminal events as they may be. They're going to appear as small bumps on a larger history. Climate change is coming at us like a train barreling down the track. And democracy and a lot else will not survive a warming temperature. We simply we've never seen anything like this in human history. It's global. As we measure time, it's effectively permanent. And it affects everything, everybody, everywhere.
Maybe we need, here's my most controversial question. Obviously, I don't believe this. Maybe we need an autocrat to get the planet in the right shape. Yeah. Why can't dictators and autocrats and authoritarians see what's good for the future and the planet and do what's right by it?
Two big answers to that. One is autocrats have their own agenda, which has very little to do with the public good.
Right.
That's simply the history. They really don't care about what's good for the public in the whole. And the second is a more theoretical reason. Autocrats, Donald Trump in particular, in our history, have no interest in wider information flows. Information is what makes democracy work, the free flow of information. It's not so much a free market that makes democracy, it's the free flow of ideas. And you can see this tragic failures in, say, how Trump handled the COVID crisis. He simply shut off the scientific information.
Yeah.
And Anthony Fauci became the butt of all of the hostility. But it was effectively incompetence due to control of information. So two big reasons. There are lots more, I think, as well.
James Hansen, you quote, says, "We can't fix the climate until we fix democracy first. You have a brief history of how we got here, and I would want to ask you, at least in America, how did we get to a place where I think it's fair to say, maybe you disagree around the edges, that one of our major political parties no longer believes in democracy, but more supportive of an authoritarian leader and state?
I think that's right. Climate change got out of control long ago. We knew enough to do a lot better than we've done on the climate issue. I was briefly part of the Carter administration transition team back in 1976, and we knew enough to say to Carter at that time that climate change was real. The first warning to a U.S. president was 1965. The reason we didn't do anything much about it, or didn't do anything nearly adequate, and certainly nothing at the governmental level, was the power of oil, coal, fossil fuels in general. They bought whole districts in Congress. They bought senators. They shut down courts and so forth. And so there's a lot of money here. So democracy as it presently exists, I don't think it's going to make it through this era successfully. It's got to be revised. So think of democracy 4.0 is where we have to go. 3.0 started in Philadelphia and in France in the late 18th century. And that was good for a lot of reasons, but it's not wired, it's not structured to deal with global issues and systemic issues like climate change. So if your question to me was, can democracy make it? My answer is no. But can authoritarians make it? The answer is a louder no. There's no way, no how. There's no reformed authoritarian rule that could adjust to the complexities of global climate issues. So democracy has to step up. At every phase of democracy, there's been a widening of we the people, the constituency. In the beginning, it was white guys and property owners and so forth. And then we grudgingly gave the franchise to people of previous servitude and to women and so forth. That struggle still goes on. But for the future, we have to begin to think about the rights of future generations and how we structure governments so they're scientifically smart, morally human, and rule by law.
It seems like in this day and age, as affected by technology and culture and information, that human beings, maybe we're not we've evolved past the point of thinking long term. We're only thinking about tomorrow. I mean, if you study indigenous tribal humans, you realize that they did think about tomorrow. They thought a lot about sustainability. They made everything last. They didn't take more than they needed. And you can pick it up from there. But it feels like today we don't think about future generations very much, even many of us with kids and grandchildren. Tell me I'm wrong.
I think you're right and wrong. I think what has happened to our attention span has been a foreshortening of our sight line.
Yeah.
And if you're inclined to think about technology, what did television do to us but and capitalism and technology both created this culture of instant gratification. So short sight lines. And so if you think about this, we created a culture of I, me, and mine. What we have to build is a culture of we, ours, and us. And the us has to include future generations.
Right.
And so I think it's not hardwired into us, not yet anyway. But it's a cultural artifact of constant technological change and no control. One of the essays in the book is by David Guston at Arizona State University. His essay is entitled or deals with no representation or no innovation without representation. And you think about that, we didn't vote to have Facebook. We didn't vote to have Twitter. We had no part in these things other than being in a market that offers these as choices we make. But we didn't stop. There's no mechanism to stop and think about this. And then, Pete, think about the origin of that. In 1994, Newt Gingrich zeroed out the Office of Technology Assessment, which was our one agency in government assigned to look ahead to the far corners that would respond to requests by members of Congress to do studies on particular technologies. It was a little bit like turning off your headlights on a dark night on a windy mountain road. Huh. And so we did all these things without understanding what we were doing. We had no forewarning device.
Yeah, I did not know that about Newt Gingrich in that office, and I'd never heard or read about that. If I have, I'd forgotten. I mean, the right for so long, and certainly to this day, has not seen government, local, state, or federal government as the solution. In fact, Ronald Reagan, of course, made sure that people in their minds thought it was the problem. To me, that seems to be the crux of the problem, that people don't see government as the solution. They see it as corrupt and political and so on. And there's plenty of that to go around. But don't you think so much of it here in America is our understanding, our tainted view of what government is supposed to do for us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've had a 40-some-year war against the idea of government. And so the idea of getting government off your back, but now the right wing wants to put it in your bedroom. But when they get government off your back, they, of course, leave corporations on your back. And the expansive government developed by Franklin Roosevelt and before that Woodrow Wilson was designed to curtail the worst excesses of rogue corporations and the robber barons in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so, and the right wing will want big government when the climate change-driven storms hit their neighborhoods. They're going to demand the government and FEMA show up and repair the damage and rebuild the roads and schools and so forth. So they want big government for some things, but the idea that government can be made a real asset in this transition era means, in part, reinventing government. I think Biden has started the process of beginning to think about how you govern systemically. How do you get government so that the right hand and the left hand know what each is doing? But the idea that somehow the government is the problem has taken hold of the hard right in this country and a lot of the left, too. But the idea somehow that capitalism and corporations are without flaws. Go back to the banking crisis of 2008.
Right.
I mean, that was capitalism nearly brought the whole global economy crashing down. What rescued it was government action. So the idea, if government, you think of Enron and you think of all the government, the corporate scandals and overruns and inefficiencies. So the problem here is government's never going to be better than what we expect it to be and demanded it be.
Talk to me a little bit more about, because there's a lot in this book, there's a lot of essays that deal with regulation and policy. You know intimately about the history of government regulation and policy, and you mentioned the financial crisis of 2008. Mm-hmm. We could talk about the cause of that for a long time, but the one primary cause was the deregulation of the financial industry. The banks were allowed to create risky financial schemes and instruments that allowed people to bet on all kinds of crazy ideas, including against their own banks, some of which went out of business. We all lost as a result. I certainly did. And my house was underwater. We were underwater on our mortgage for about 10 years in a place that housing always went up. So we can talk about that. But as you write specifically in the open, you say we have to better understand ourselves and what we become shaped by, a culture of consumption that is ravaging the ecosphere, and what we might yet become with foresight and a bit of help from the angels of our better nature. Talk about how government regulation or lack thereof has created so much damage to our ecosphere. You could give me example after example, and you mentioned some of them in the opening and throughout the book.
Well, the biggest, in terms of getting from here to a decent society, in a post-climate disaster world means curtailing the power of fossil fuels. They've been given a free ride. We still subsidize fossil fuels. The numbers vary depending on who you believe, but the other day I saw a number of 700 and some billion per year for fossil fuels. And if you count all the direct and indirect subsidies all the way out to parking for fossil fuel employees, it's not charged, to direct payments and access to federal lands and so forth, the number's probably a good bit larger, and that's per year. Secondly, their intention, quite clearly, is to burn all the reserves that they have, which means when you translate that, they can destroy the entire planet and not break a single law.
Right.
There's nothing on the books that says they can't do this. So they've gotten a free ride. Pete, they knew, we know that they knew as far back as 1977 that burning fossil fuels would bring the planet to catastrophe. That was known. Their own scientists knew that. And so the internal documents have all been made public now. Probably precedes 1977. The first scientific warning I mentioned to a U.S. president was 1965. And I think that they probably knew it back in those days. And they had some of the best climate scientists around. So the challenge is to regulate them out of business. And you stop and think, how do you do that? Well, how did, for example, Britain get rid of slavery? They didn't fight a civil war. Choices where you either buy the slaves or basically seize the asset. And you can subsidize, you can buy things, and so you can use the power of government to end fossil fuels. But we've got to end the fossil fuel. We have to disinvent fire, as Amory Lovins once said.
Right.
And burning fossil fuels is the source of a whole lot that ails us. And then, Pete, you've got to connect that to a larger pattern also. It's the sale of fossil fuels that has also fueled discontent in the Middle East and terrorism worldwide. Iran and Saudi Arabia and the petrostates, including Russia, are all depend on the sale of fossil fuels. So,
yeah, military historian Tom Ricks once said on Meet the Press before the war in Iraq, invasion of Iraq, and I think after the Gulf War, it was maybe just after 9/11, when Tim Russert asked him, how do we fight terrorism? How do we end terrorism? And he said, well, we never end terrorism. The best way to fight it is to not be dependent on their oil, on their energy, to create our own energy resources. That's the best way to fight terrorism. That was a military historian answering that question, not with counterinsurgency or intelligence or giant military deployments.
Yeah, you say, too, that fossil fuels, the Koch brothers and dark money, also fossil fuel this hardcore right wing that doesn't want to govern. And we're about to have a House of Representatives governed by people who don't like government and know nothing about it, have no particular appetite for it, and not likely to be ever very good at it anyway.
So talking more about, of course, the challenges here, and when it comes to free market economics, you write a bit about that as well. How do we incentivize the right forms of energy better than we have? More specifically, what are some of the things that would work here? And furthermore, I feel like the hardest question is always like, if one country does it, how do we get all of the rest of the countries to do something similar?
Well, one thing that needs to happen is a desubsidizing of all fossil fuels.
Yes.
Very rapid phase out of public support for accumulated reserves and drilling and so forth. The other part of this is the proper use of federal financing and incentive structure. Biden's IRA bill has started that process. So worldwide, we're adding something like 1 gigawatt per day of solar and wind power. It's hugely rapid, and the costs have come down dramatically. So I think we're on the path. If we had 50 years to make the transition, I don't think anybody needs to be worried. But I think we have to make the transition in more like 15 or 20 years. So by 2050, the idea of zeroing out fossil fuels, and I think that's possible to do. But the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry isn't going to go quietly into the night. We're going to have to beat them at the polls. We're going to have to beat them in government at every level. And Pete, if I had one criticism to make of the environmental movement, is while we were doing all the great science and writing lots of great books and so forth, they were taking over school boards and county boards of trustees and state legislatures and courts and congressional committees and so forth. We need to do politics on this side. There'll be no change without some pretty hard battles ahead, and they're going to be political. This, in every way, is a political fight. But the good news is, I think that we have a huge majority of people. If you put the question to people, do you want to drink dirty water? No. Do you want to breathe dirty air? Absolutely not.
Right.
Do you want climate chaos in your future? No. But the bridge that connects what we want as people, and not just in the United States, but worldwide, and the policies, regulations, and so forth that we get, has been turned into a toll bridge. And that has to end. We've got to get money out of politics. And that's just going to be one battle after another. You've seen Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court on the take, and Samuel Alito not much better, and the contamination of federal authority. We need rules-based federal agencies. But this is not an impossible fight at all. This is one we can win. There's a huge majority. You get the question right. There's a huge majority of us that wants to do these things.
There's a question, a thought experiment. Are humans even capable of democracy? In chapter 1 of your book by the great Frances Moore Lappé, is that how you say her last name? Democracy, It's Who We Are and What the Earth Needs is the title of it. And the thought experiment is, are humans even capable of democracy? Going back to the issues that you're connecting here with climate change and democratic transformation, tell me more about her work and that thought experiment, if you want.
Sure. Frances Moore Lappé came to public attention years ago, half century ago, with her little book called Die for a Small Planet. And she's a systems thinker. She connected food to all kinds of things, including a book she did a few years back on democracy and so forth. And a very lovely person, thinks deeply about all kinds of things, but somebody who can connect the dots. On a thought experiment, I think there's a lot of skepticism going back to, people like Plato and the democracy doesn't work and it always becomes oligarchy and so forth. I think democracy does work. And I think it's not even as bad as she points out in her chapter, as Winston Churchill put it, the democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have ever been tried.
Yeah.
I think it's better than that. We could celebrate we. And I think democracy starts, as John Dewey said a long time ago, starts in the local community where we take people seriously and we honor their dignity and their participation and so forth. And people show up for meetings. It's not a constant battle. But one of the essays in the book, too, by Hélène Landemore, a French citizen who teaches at Yale, and her book, Open Democracy, there are lots of good examples of democracy working. But it means that we get serious about inventing ways to engage people, not in a way it's a nuisance and a pain in the butt, but engage people in making decisions that affect their lives. And do people want to be part of that? Yes. I think part of what ails America is most people don't feel like their opinions matter. And in fact, they don't matter. All the research shows that decisions made in Washington have more to do with corporations and wealthy than John Q. citizen down on Main Street. So we have to invent ways and discover ways. And there are great examples from Scandinavian countries and from France and Iceland and lots of other places. I don't think we're the anti-democratic people. I think we've kind of become that because the system is, Trump was right on one thing, the system is rigged, but it's rigged not against Trump, but it's rigged for the wealthy.
Right. Well, talk more about one part of that system, education. You've got an essay, more than one. I think it's in part 3 of the book. I like this, Academic Culture, Democracy, and Climate Change by Michael Crow and William Dabars. Say a thing or two about them and talk to me about why education is important. I think in your introduction, you talk about how young kids need to learn how ecosystems work, how ecology works, which, by the way, I think I learned more about that in one of your earlier books than anywhere else in my life. It was really important for me to learn that. It's impacted my life ever since. I think about systems differently, but I should have learned that when I was even younger. Go ahead.
We all should. Well, the essay by Michael Crow and William Dabars is a great essay. Michael Crow, president of Arizona State, has took over some decades ago a probably third-rate state university, built it into a real powerhouse. And so Arizona State, in all the surveys, shows up at the top of the list of innovative universities and creativity. The Global Futures Lab there and other parts of the university built since he's been there have become globally recognized. In that essay, one of the things that he proposes is that nobody should graduate from any school, college, or university without knowing how the Earth works as a physical system, which means just what planet am I on? And then the basic principle of democracy. We took democracy out of the agenda for most curricula, and it needs to go back in. And my home discipline is political science. We gave up on it. We started doing all kind of behavioral research and so forth. We need to put citizenship back into the curriculum. But citizenship now in two different ways. One is citizen of a political system, and the other is citizen of an ecosystem. We're plain members and citizens, as Aldo Leopold said a long time ago, of an ecology. And so that changes, that transition to the next democracy has got to be something that looks a lot like, it's going to be a broader democracy. The we isn't just the people, but all the creatures in a particular area on this planet need to be included, their interests included in one way or another. And the lawsuits that young people are bringing on climate change, they're starting to win worldwide. That they have standing, their interests are being compromised. And if you look for hope in this, I think one of the great reasons for hope is there's a majority of us that favor these kind of changes, but there's also a younger generation rising to the occasion, fighting battles in the streets and in the courts, and they're starting to win. There's just an inevitability to it. So if you put all the pessimism aside, it's possible to see us winning this war. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but we're winning. And I think the logic of climate change is driving us to do things that we should have done anyway.
Yeah. Very well said, that we should have done anyway. It's a way to think about your own life and what role you play on the planet in the ecosystem. Say a little bit more about how we should think of ourselves within the space that we take up on our journey and within the amount of consumption that we use. I think about consumption, my own and my family's. Every time I hear a knock at the door, it's another box that my daughter ordered something, and I've talked with her about it several times. Like, let me just pick up a few things, make a list, and I'll get them all at once. Don't you understand how this works? But
right.
Without throwing her too far under the bus, she doesn't seem to care. She needs that paperclip right now.
Well, I don't want to talk about your daughter. I had 2 boys. I didn't have daughters. So, but consumption is baked into us. Somebody said once that we are exposed to something like 5,000 advertisements per day. Now, let's assume that's half wrong, but everything from, the Nike swoosh on a ball cap to advertisements that pop up on your computer to billboards on the streets and so forth. It's a lot. And what this has done is to deflect us away from community and into consumption. And I think part of the answer here, and then we're suffering on the other side, all the reports from psychologists and so forth, we're suffering from loneliness. Well, how could that possibly have happened? We've been isolated. We're consumers, not community members. And this is where this change in pronouns really matters a lot, from I, me, and mine to we, ours, and us. And the happiest people are people that are engaged with other people doing stuff, not consuming. So I think there's a transition. And if you ask people, would you rather have a block party or, let's say, a collective barn raising like the Amish do, or work with somebody on something, I think most people would jump at the opportunity to be engaged with people in meaningful work and not spend an afternoon at the mall, kind of mindless, consumptive nihilism. And then, I could go on this.
Well, no, I mean, everything you're saying is, I think one of the things that you can do is tie all of this together to get a sense of community and to feel like you're raising a barn, is join your local political movement that believes in, supports democracy, has a general understanding of consumption and ecology and environmentalism and sustainability, and get involved, because you will be doing great work and connecting with people and feeling less lonely. Ties it all together.
Yeah. In other words, I think have a party, invite everybody, celebrate, and reminds me a little bit of that joke when the fellow gets to heaven. He's been great all his life, and he was a priest and did good work. And St. Peter says, great life is wonderful, congratulations, but you got one thing wrong. The word we used was celebrate, not celibate. And there's a lesson here for us. I think that we...
Wait, what did you say, God? Did you just say I could have been having sex this entire... No, I didn't hear you say that, God.
Well, I'll leave it right there. But there's a core assumption that if we just bought enough stuff, we'd be happy. We'd be better people. And of course, that idea goes back to the early days of advertising. Edward Bernays was a cousin of Sigmund Freud's, and he started the first major advertising firm in this country. And he learned how to sell things, and selling has become quite an art form. But the question now is, how do we sell a better future, a more humane future, a more just future that includes everybody, including that 7th generation off on the horizon? And we can do that.
How do you sell that you'll be happier working out of a shed, doing similar work to your old corporate media job that you drove back and forth into New York City and had a park? And like, how do you sell my life? It's hard. It's a hard sell because people think so much about financial security, and they think about materialism and consumption, and I need to have this or that to be happy, when the truth is, over and over, it bears out that often it's the less you have and the more that you do and who you're connected to, which brings you the true sense of wealth. I'm trying to hang with you on language, and I'm trying to impress you. And I want to just ask you another question about our friend Richard Louv, who you include an essay in. He is, of course, a longtime friend of mine, a contributor to this podcast, as a matter of fact. He writes an essay titled Watering the Roots of democracy, where he talks about how nature builds values and conditions required in a democracy. He talks about biophilic design and what role that plays in the future of our systems and infrastructure. Tell me more about Louv and his ideas that you share.
Well, Rich Louv, like you, has been a longtime friend and wrote a book called The Last Child in the Woods some years ago. And had a series of good books on that theme since. But the idea of connecting kids back into nature, and it's not a Republican or Democratic idea, it's just apolitical. And everybody can agree, yeah, the kids need more time out at the parks and in the forest and down to streams and out of the shore and so forth. So Rich started an organization called Children in Nature Network to do that. And it includes everything like urban design. How do you design cities with places, wild places for kids to go? How do you make them safe places? And how do you begin to develop a environmental or ecological awareness there? And kids are connected with animals and so forth. And it's also ties back in with philosophy. When John Dewey, a long time ago, wrote that the origin of democracy is in the local community. It's in the local school ground. It starts at the very local level where kids' ideas matter. They're treated well. They're treated with dignity and so forth. And they assume that their ideas do matter. And then you equip them with the apparatus of thinking democratically and the skills of being a democratic citizen, being able to engage other people. So Rich Louv's chapter, I thought, was one of the gems in the book, but it represents part of his work over a lot of years to deal with young people, get them into nature, make those experiences meaningful and structured, and make them available broadly to a lot of underprivileged kids that for whom nature is just an abstraction.
So important. I'm so glad that you asked him and that you included that one. As we wrap up, we've touched on several of the essays in the book. It's 3 different sections. Maybe give me one more essay or one more thought here before we wrap up that we haven't talked about in your new book. Democracy in a Hotter Time, Climate Change and Democratic Transformation. Bill McKibben writes the intro. Such a big deal. You guys are all such big deals now.
Well, Bill is if there's ever a Nobel Prize given for environmental work, Bill ought to get it. He's been out there since, I think his first book on climate change goes back to 1988 or 89.
Yeah.
And then a bunch since. He's active all across the world now, and one of the great sources of information and insight into climate, democracy, and lots of things. So he's a powerhouse.
The End of Nature?
End of Nature, yeah.
No, that was 2006, but that's one of his books. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah, he is a powerhouse, and trying to figure out which book. That was a later
edition of it. Actually, the first edition came out, I think, in 89 or...
Oh, got it. You're right. No, it is that book. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. What about him or anything else?
Well, Bill McKibben is been kind of a Paul Revere for climate issues, and he was a person early on that said we were building a different planet. He later wrote a book called Earth, EAARTH, that we're building we're making this a different planet. You know, if Pete, this gets to an important point. Democracy was born in the Holocene. Its future will be in what's now being called the Anthropocene, which is a hotter, more capricious climate. And that will change everything. We are different people at hotter temperatures. Concrete, metals, all are different as you raise the temperature. Systems work differently. Water works differently. When it gets hot, it rises. And that creates one of the drivers for sea level rise and loss of coastal areas. Droughts are more frequent. Storms are bigger. And so the burdens on government to hold all this together and keep people safe becomes more difficult to do as temperatures go up. It isn't just you turn the thermostat up and everything stays the same. That's not what's going to happen. So this is a time test, as Bill McKibben puts it, to begin to build the government infrastructure and the instinct for democracy before we pass some threshold where it's too late. There is such a thing as Martin Luther King pointed out in a famous speech once given at Oberlin here, in which he said that democracy, it's possible to be too late. And in the case of the transition to a climate-proof democracy, we can come too late, where things just get so out of control that we fall apart. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're close to that, but that is certainly a possibility.
Right.
But if there's a future for if there's a good future for humankind, it's got to be in a reinvented democratic world. And there's no particular formula for that.
One of the most important books I've read is a collection of your essays titled Hope is an Imperative, the Essential David Orr, which had, I think, about 33 of your essays in that book. And I read all of them in a couple weeks over one summer, annotated it, and then interviewed you about as much of it as I could. You have always been someone who brings people together, important thinkers together, who keeps us inspired and optimistic. What is the driving force behind your optimism on these issues, which seem so bleak now?
Well, I think I don't know that I like the words optimism or pessimism, but I know we have to avoid despair. And that we're at our best when we're working with people doing big things that are bigger than we are, that will take longer than our lifetime to do. And I think one of the things that makes me optimistic is the technology, for example, to make the change is there. We don't need to invent much more of anything. We can take most of this stuff off the shelf. The second thing is, I think this really is, if you get the questions right, do you want to breathe dirty air and drink dirty water and so forth? Everybody, 8 billion people would mostly respond in unison, hell no. And then do you want peace? And the big thing now with the Israeli-Hamas conflict is to understand how the wrongs on both sides can be not righted, but dealt with in a long-term way that takes care of those kids on both sides, Israeli children and Palestinian kids. And I think that we're going through a gauntlet right now. It's going to be a tough period. These are not easy questions, and antagonisms and hatreds are now at fever pitch. And so the transition to this world dealing with climate change, but climate change, and yet ironically, Pete, dealing with climate change and looking at that longer-term future could help us deal better with the near-term crises, I think. There's an irony in this. And I think the dealing with climate change, which is an everybody, everywhere, all time issue, could help us see ways to solve current problems. Israelis and Palestinians both, whatever their future, we know water scarcity is going to be part of it.
Right.
Whatever their future, we know it's going to be hotter and tougher to live in the Middle East. And they have common problems that have to be solved collectively. But to start to focus on that instead of terrorism. But I don't underestimate the challenge of dealing with terrorist groups, but it's a tougher issue that is linked to all these long-term survival issues. But back to your earlier question, can humans think long-term? I think we can. But it means lots of changes in how we educate and what we pay attention to.
Paying attention to your work has been really important. Paying attention to this collection of essays is really important. I think paying attention for longer than a few seconds on social media, on television, and the internet is what's really important. You don't even have a smartphone. Like, what do you just sit around reading and writing all day?
I don't want a phone smarter than me. Well, there's an interesting issue here. Technology solves problems some of us don't have. I'll have to get eventually. I'll have to get a smartphone. I know that, but I'm waiting for this one to wear out. That's the Scotch side of me.
You're never gonna. You'll have to get one eventually. You're never going to get one. But go ahead, make your point.
Well, technology is a funny thing, and when you think about buying you never buy a technology. You don't buy a thing. You buy into a system.
Right.
Of things.
Right.
It has mines and wells and advertising and all kind of other things that can be addictive as they intend to be for these things to be. And they don't intend for you to buy a phone and keep it for the rest of your life. They intend to sell you a phone every year as they can upgrade it and add this app or add something else. So I think one of the things I hope happens in this better future is we become more discerning about our artifacts. And they do have politics, as somebody pointed out a long time ago. There are politics around cell phones and nuclear power plants and all these things that we buy, but they're not just individual technologies. They're parts of systems, and that's the rub. Once you buy into it, then you bought into mines that take lithium out of mines in Chile and Peru, and you're part of child labor practices in China, and so forth goes on. But we can't go back. But I think we could begin to rethink what the future is, where we're headed.
So well said. And I love living in David Orr's world, and I'm going to continue to try. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope we can talk again soon. It's been way too long.
I agree.
Good.
People, good to see you. Thanks for the opportunity to be on.
Of course.
All right, there he goes, David Orr. Go get the book, Democracy in a Hotter Time. I've really enjoyed reading these quite smart, very readable essays, which I think are so important and inspiring as well. So go check that out, and all of his work, so important to me. And I was really happy to get him on. I try to get folks on that are both very smart, good at talking, and usually have big followings that can help promote this podcast. But I make plenty of exceptions for people who don't have huge followings necessarily, aren't going to be these, quote, big influencers on social media and media in general, but certainly are overall the long run. And David Orr is certainly one of those guys that doesn't play with all of the modern media stuff. He writes, he teaches, he puts together organizations and initiatives, many of which I've been part of, and real excited to have been and to get him back on. So definitely check out his work. All right, that's all I've got for you on today's program. Scheduled to talk with David Rothkopf, Eric Siegel. Who else should we get on before the week is over? You let me know. standupwithpete@gmail.com for all of your needs to connect with me or the show. And as always, you can sign up for a paid subscription for just $5 a month or more. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. The show is free, but it isn't cheap. You can't do it without your support. This show is completely supported by independent subscribers like you. So please sign up if you haven't already. Be the change you want to see in the world. John Carroll singing us out. Hope to see you tomorrow night at the Hangar. And anytime on the Discord platform. You're never alone if you're a member of the stand-up community. Talk tomorrow.
Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.